Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 Dev Diary. This week we're covering Argentina in its totality. I suppose because the release date in March is coming up so close, they really have to rattle through as many Dev Diaries as they can before the release. I'm actually recording this after the Dev Diary has been released too, so at the end of the Dev Diary there will be some comments for us to go over. But since it's already out, I'm probably just going to blast through it and not be too try-hard about it. So without further ado, let's begin. Hola amigos, we are introduced to this week's Dev Diary with a nice little bit of Spanish and some preamble to what is happening in Argentina at the game's start. So the Dev Diary begins by talking about how at the start of the game, Argentina is in a pretty good economic position. They say to rival even Canada and Australia, but internally there's going to be some massive upheaval once the Great Depression finally arrives on shores and kind of cripples all of the great work they've been working towards. Because of that, there's going to be a military coup, which really brings down faith in the political system with some bad elections in the 1930s, as well as massive industrial reforms needed to get things really back on track again. The country is currently also locked into a trade deal with Britain, I believe, trading beef, so there's that to deal with, as well as the previously mentioned naval treaty that Brazil, Chile and Argentina have all signed up to ensure that none of them become major naval powers and kind of dominate the others, so that is something you'll also have to deal with. These will all be seen as spirits, which we'll look at now. So there we see the infamous decade, bringing down your stability and war support, but giving you some unaligned support. Not a massively terrible debuff, it's definitely something you can sit on, but not the best that your country is maybe having some problems currently. Political corruption comes in. I guess that's what happens when you kind of overthrow the government and then have a pretty corrupt government. This one comes with political power gain positive and war support negative. Now in the early game, war support doesn't do massively too much for you other than help you change the economy and mobilization law in case you need to rapidly build up, but other than that, this isn't the worst debuff in the world either. It's really just the construction speed that's kind of bringing it down. The Roco-Runciman Treaty. This is the agreement signed between Argentina and the United Kingdom for the exportation of meat. I'm actually surprised how many buffs and debuffs it gives equally. Yeah, this isn't necessarily within your favour. This is probably something you're going to want to reform to kind of work better for you. Yes, and there is the legacy of the naval arms race, which we also saw with Brazil. So don't get any funny ideas about building up a major fleet. It's not going to be happening here. Okay, with that all said, let's move over to the historical branch, where we see our previous leader of Pedro Justo, I guess, with some very trendy new art. Look, he's got a nice hat, he's got like a ribbon going across his outfit. He gives me very Latin America vibes, I like him. And also he gets a trendy buff, giving him political power gain and construction speed, which counters the construction speed debuff we saw earlier. It's at this point we get to start looking at the focus tree in question, and this is the focus tree in its totality before we focus on the historical section. And I just wanted to give some brief overlook about what I was thinking when we first see it. So on the left we've got a communist tree, which is looking kind of sparse, separated from the everything else because it doesn't share a single branch going through, but we'll cover that. In the middle, we've got a democratic branch with some splits between America and Britain before moving to the bottom with a shared foreign policy branch. On the right, we have the non-aligned and historical path, which you see here, as well as the fash path on the right, both of which share a conquest branch at the bottom. I guess that's technically also foreign policy, but not quite the same foreign policy as on the left. And then at the end, we also have an industrial tree, which is just kind of hiding up there in the top right. So what do we make of the historical tree? I guess we should dive straight in. We begin by putting Roberto Maria Ortiz in power, I assume being the guy we see in the National Focus art. By taking him, the first thing you're going to be doing is trying to minimize the political corruption national spirit that we started with earlier. Following on from that, you'll have to decide whether you're going to work alongside the British or cut ties with the British. In the case of going historical, you're going to be working with the British to fix up the economy and maybe fix that treaty we saw earlier. The next section of the focus tree is divided into two. On the left we see some focuses which help build up the Argentinian economy and try and fix, I guess, the result of the Great Depression, eventually leading to what looks to be a research slot. But on the right we've got the Castillo cabinet, in which we get another leader, probably, to replace the previous leader, who probably isn't going to be too popular. So unpopular it seems that this may cause some military dissent, and unless you take these decisions that you can see here, whether you sanction the generals to try and get rid of them, or increase military salaries to try and appease them, there's going to be a civil war. Because what would Hoi 4 be without civil wars? Luckily, it doesn't appear to be too dramatic a mechanic. It just seems to be something similar to kind of what you saw with Mexico, or maybe the peasants' coup that you saw in Poland. And I think there's also one with Bulgaria. If you don't deal with one of the factions in Bulgaria, I think that can also cause a civil war. Regardless, it's basically another one of those mechanics, so nothing too dramatically new here. To get rid of the civil war entirely, you're going to have to decide whether you're going to go down a historical route in which you march to create a quiet turnover in government via March to La Casa Rosada, or you also have the option to go slightly ahistorical, and they say enact federal intervention in states taken over by the military. What's most interesting here is how they're quite openly saying there's the third option of just letting the civil war happen. That's kind of interesting. Usually civil war is seen as a failure state in Hoi 4, so the fact that they're openly saying just let the civil war happen and win it could hypothetically mean that there's an even better situation if you fight the civil war and win, but maybe they're just saying that's something else that can happen. Following on from your potential civil war and maybe successfully won civil war, you then have to decide whether you want to reject the Allies and go down your own path, or join the Allies and help them in the problems of World War II. Joining the Allies will then lead on to the foreign policy branch, but that is also shared with the Democratic branch, so I think the Dev Diary is going to move over to the Democratic branch so we can take a look at that before we see the foreign policy. Ah yes, the Democratic branch, for people who don't like fun. That's a joke, by the way. So it seems once you take the clean election, the first thing you're going to be doing is trying to get rid of the negative effects of the infamous decade by really putting your government in order, and then working towards the embetterment of the nation. I see university reforms to give you a research slot. I see promote urbanization, which is probably going to be to do with civs and maybe infrastructure. And I also see the social welfare fund, which is probably stuff like stability and maybe political power gain. That's kind of where my mind goes. Once you've secured the interior, it's time to take the focus Argentina for all and decide where you want to go in terms of your military. The options available are working with the Americas and then maybe getting some US Army training, or going with Britain and getting the Royal Air Force or the Royal Navy's help. There is also the central path, the internal focus, which seems to be about making your own democratic bastion in South America. It will be interesting to see how they make that the most enticing path. Usually working with the major powers seems to be the better bet, so going alone, not really too sure. It also has less focuses attached to it. Hard to say. Also, as a tidbit at the bottom, we can actually see that joining the Allies is mutually exclusive with Bastion of Peace, which kind of tells me that Bastion of Peace is the creating your own democratic faction option, and if that's the case, are there going to be decisions to encourage your neighbours to join you, or is it just going to be creating a faction that nobody's going to be in? Because, I mean, everybody just wants to join the Allies, right? That's the one with America, that's the one with Britain, so kind of doing your own really is a big question mark in terms of what your game plan is going to be. Okay, and let's now cover that foreign policy branch that we talked about earlier. So this section is available to both the non-aligned Argentina as well as the democratic Argentina, and it begins with aligning with the Monroe Doctrine. In doing so, you should have some better options available to help you work alongside London and America. I don't see anything in here that's mutually exclusive, so American allyship should work well for making sure that, hopefully, nothing negative is happening inside of your country regarding maybe some German spies with End Operation Bolivar, but also stuff like US Marine training programs, which I guess gives you some, that has to be experience, right? On the right, we have the Envoy to London, which I really like the national focus ad for. I just think it looks really good, and it also has some very interesting developments regarding certain Falkland Islands, or I guess I should say Las Malvinas. In this, you'll have the opportunity to secure the Falkland and South Georgia Islands and set them up as strong naval fortresses to aid in the war. Well, that really does make me wonder, to what end are you going to be fighting the conflict of World War II around the Falklands? I couldn't imagine even how the Germans are going to be in that region. But sure, let's make them a bulwark. Sure, I guess we can. I suppose the most interesting focuses here are at the very bottom, extinguishing communism and fasc from the South America. So that's probably going to be war goals, depending on what they've done with Peru, against Paraguay, Peru, and Venezuela, right? It seems to me that really only one of those countries is going to be next to you in order for you to do it, that being Paraguay. But in theory, that is, hypothetically, a nation you can go to war with as Argentina and democratic. So hey, there's some content there. The dev diary does a quick skip over now to the industrial branch, which is quite compact, I have to say. It's interestingly compact because the political focus tree is very wide and sparsely spread out. It kind of makes it look kind of thin. But no, the industrial tree is very tight, compact, and covers a good range of things. On the left, we can see the production and research section, which at the bottom, technical schools. Now, am I wrong? Or is that not the meme of there's like a black guy and he's holding up like a test tube and he's got juice in it? Do you know what I mean? Juice guy? Is that not juice guy? I think that's juice guy meme. Certainly, it has to be, right? Towards the middle, we've got industrial expansion, which I probably think is your standard civs, consumer goods, bonuses, and mills. On the right, we've got economic tax reforms, which is going to be to do with infrastructure, railroads, and resource extraction. And thus, that question remains, what are the other focuses? Let's take a look. So reach out to the great powers is a way for you to take out loans from said great powers. This will provide you with a boost at the expense of daily political power. And then if you want to repay the loans, you can get rid of those bonuses and get back the PP that you've lost. So that's kind of interesting. It's like a debt mechanic. On the far right of the industry tree, we see the building up of the Argentine metropole. So that's going to be about encouraging immigration, interestingly, from Wales, Italy, and France, and promoting what they say is a more traditional rural lifestyle of old towards larger cities. So if I was to guess, that's probably going to involve upgrading states. You know how like some states can be rural? That's probably going to be about like upgrading state categories so they can fit even more factories in them. So really about just buffing up the potential growth that Argentina has. At the bottom of the industrial expansion tree, we can see you can either revisit or revise the Rocco-Runciman Treaty, which is pretty good because of all of the starting national spirits I saw, that one was probably the most egregious. Alright, let's keep moving forward. And now we have arrived at the fasc branch, which to me was the most anticipated branch of this entire DLC. And I'm just going to come out of the bag right now. I'm kind of disappointed, but let's get into it first and see what we're looking at. So beginning at the top, instead of going with Britain, we've decided to work with the nationalists and then cut ties with Britain, which brings us down our own path where we get to decide whether we want to encourage more German investments or go down a more Italian-Argentine diplomacy. In general, this is going to be about shaping your own version of fascist Argentina. Now, this is not to say that there aren't some interesting things you can probably do right at the start of the game. So, for starters, it looks like establishing a foothold gives you a very early war goal against Uruguay, which is pretty good for some nice early expansion. We also see corporatism leading all the way down to what looks to be a research slot. And on the right, there is a historical precedent for supporting a Spanish coup, which, if all goes well, allows you to demand compensation from Spain, allowing you to get Equatorial Guinea. That means Argentina will be in Africa of all places. I do have to say that the stuff to do with the Spanish Civil War I do like, especially the idea that there's compensation you can gain from it, because it's a part of the game where you've chosen to invest in a certain event that is going to happen, and therefore you're going to be able to change the destiny of your country by leaning into it even more. I'm kind of sad that there's nothing here to do with the events on the other side of the ocean that you're dealing with. Maybe stuff to do with Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific Islands, or Japan. But never mind, I suppose. Maybe Chile will have something to do with that, considering their coast actually is facing the Pacific Ocean. So moving on further down the tree, you get to basically decide whether you want to go with the Axis-aligned route, as in encouraging German investments, working as a semi-German aligned nation in South America before you eventually join the Axis, or going down the Italo-Argentine diplomacy route, in which eventually you can decide to go Argentina first. You can actually swap these. There's no like decision where you can do one or the other, but in general, those are your options. We don't really know too much, but one can only assume that Argentina first involves making your own faction. But we do know that if you do choose to go alone, you can get Spirit of the Conquistadors, which gives you 10 war support, 20% division attack, so that's going to be pretty useful for fighting in some of those mountains and jungles, a reduction in Justify war goal time, because we all could use a speed up, and a little bit of support. That's a pretty good national spirit. With all of the internal politics done, you eventually arrive at Dominate the South, which is actually, I believe, accessible through the non-aligned historical path. So you can go down the historical path, and instead of going down the foreign diplomacy, join the Allies, kind of do all that stuff with America and Britain, you can say, screw them, dominate the South, and you can take this path instead. On the left, we see integrating Operation Bolivar, so that's probably taking all of those German spies and bringing them into the country, and then working on some anti-American propaganda. I do wonder if that involves eventually going to war with America, considering the flag is very much so on fire. In the central position, we have something akin to what I remember with Italy, where you can either choose to befriend or align a nation, or destroy the nation. So first up on the chopping block is Paraguay, they're gone. Then it's going to be Chile, they're gone. And then it's the old enemy, so there's Brazil, and then they're gone, which opens up to South American unity, which is probably going to involve coring pretty much the entirety of South America. I can only assume also then that taking South American unity will give you war goals on Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and the free states that are currently owned by the European powers. And lastly, on the right, we have a little cheeky little focus called Argentine Island Sovereignty. Now I wonder what that could be about. Oh, it's a focus to go after the Falklands. Now, surely there's no historical precedent for this happening, right? It's going to be interesting to find out if this is going to be a mechanic like Finland, because currently with Finland, if you go into the Winter War and you're able to take, is it Leningrad? There's a decision you can do to end the war and then take the states that you have currently hold on to. So I think it's a way for you to get like the Greater Finland, in the north. I wonder if it's going to be something similar to this, where you take the island and then there's a decision for you to end the war. Or are you kind of just going to take the island and then be locked into a forever war? Because after the Conference of Casablanca, there was a doctrine of total war, only surrender, nothing else. So yeah, I'm really interested to see which way they've gone with this focus. I'll talk a little bit more about the Fash branch towards the end of the video, but let's keep moving towards the end now with the Communist branch. So we're looking at a focus tree that seems to have a good amount of policy towards reforming a country, but as I mentioned at the start of the video, they don't really have access to a foreign diplomacy branch or a conquest branch. So this is the focus tree in its entirety. So kind of take that as you will, but that's how it is. The first 7 focuses, beginning with a call to reform, are going to be about bringing Argentina into a communist state of power. So that's going to be about bringing back a guy called Rodolfo Gioldi, I think, who is currently living his best life in Brazil. Once you've done a Viva la Revolution, you'll have the ultimate classic decision that all communist trees must face. Are you Soviet aligned or are you going alone? And Argentina is no different. So with the Soviet branch, we're looking at focuses based on getting the Soviet industry, their manufacturers, I believe their MIOs too if we have the Arms Against Tyranny DLC, so really working alongside the Soviets and utilising the power they can give you. While on the right, with Fanny, who is a woman, we immediately are met by the focus Women in Industry. So, you know, there's a feminist touch in there, working towards some socialist volunteers, supporting the farmers, a very internal-looking communist nation. The centre path is a little bit more generic and shared, which is going to eventually lead down to deciding whether you want complete state atheism or whether you want to allow some level of theology into your country with liberation theology, which I believe culminates with a research slot. The Dev Diary goes on to say that their foreign policy branch for the communist tree is, quote, fairly short and sweet. I couldn't tell you how sweet it is, but I can certainly tell you it's very short, being only 4 focuses. The core choice you're going to have to choose between is whether you're going to liberate the continent, which is a bit more peaceful, eventually inviting communist countries, or a bit less peaceful, in which you're basically just going to annex them. I think for all intents and purposes, the more fun gameplay for this focus tree is going to involve you annexing them. What's a little bit odd to me is in the centre is a focus called Ocasa Escalata, which involves bringing forth a scarlet sunset to anyone who opposes you. Sadly, there's not even any art for the national focus for me to be able to guess what that's about, so if you've got any idea, please feel free to let me know. Going back to the full focus tree very briefly, if we decided to go down the right with the Forge Our Own Future with Fanny, we eventually find ourselves at the Buenos Aires conference, which has an additional 3 focuses that the Soviet side doesn't have access to. As we see here, it involves beginning with improving Patagonia, establishing free association, and taking a focus called No Gods, No Masters. So during the Buenos Aires conference, you have the ability to have Antonio Soto become your leader, who is an anarcho-syndicalist. As a leader of rural strikes in Patagonia, these 3 focuses are specifically about his leadership in that region, and thus here they are presented. I guess in my mind, I kind of would have liked to have done this slightly differently, in which if you stayed with Fanny, you got 3 focuses to do with Fanny's leadership, her leadership, and if you choose to go with Soto, you got these 3 focuses, because if you remember, they made it so that focus trees can now adapt and get different focus tree paths that you can unlock. So it could have been a good opportunity to use that depending on who gets elected at the conference, you get 3 different types of focuses to finish off the communist tree. But alas, it was not meant to be. Oh, and this is surely not a reference to any mod or anything, right? There's no famous mod that uses this slogan. Surely not, right? Surely. We're about to wrap up this dev diary, but the last thing to mention is the military branch. So the military branch is actually the same military branch that we saw with Brazil, and is also then going to be the same military branch for Chile. Their justification is that all 3 nations had a similar sort of military, naval, air force capability, and so there wasn't a necessity to make very unique military trees for either of them. They do clarify though that some focuses inside here are going to be flavoured to each country, but for the most part, it's going to be the same as what you saw with Brazil. And I talked about it in the Brazil dev diary, so I guess whatever I said there still stands true here. And so that wraps up the dev diary. There are just a few tidbits left in store to talk about. They say here that there are some things they haven't talked about in this dev diary, including a few Easter eggs. So the Easter egg here, overtly, is going to be probably 2 things that I can think of. Immediately I'm thinking independent Patagonia, that's step 1 in some regards, and the obvious one, as we're going to see in a second, is to do with a certain man named Adolf with the title of Senor at the front, I think. Oh, comments. We never do comments anymore because my dev diaries are always released at the same time that the dev diary releases publicly. I guess this is a change. Okay, so something to talk about here is, due to the fact that we had to make some major changes to how the Monroe Doctrine worked in the expansion pack, the national spirit is there to show that this specific country is under protection of the Monroe Doctrine. Does this mean that America is no longer guaranteeing every single nation in the Americas? Because if that's the case, that could be like a seriously dramatic change. That could mean that America starts guaranteeing nations around the world. Previously, it was only France and Britain that you had to worry about. If you're telling me that America is going to start guaranteeing nations, my goodness, we might have some serious problems coming up. It's going to be very interesting to find out what they mean by major changes to how the Monroe Doctrine works. Very interested to see this. It could also mean it's easier for nations to invade South America. So if you're playing as Portugal and you go Portugal-Brazil and unite the monarchies, you may be able to go on a Portuguese conquest of South America. Something I always wanted, especially from the Portuguese focus tree, is if you have core territory in the Americas, the United States should get the ability to guarantee you, like integrate you into the Monroe Doctrine so you become part of the inner circle. And it disappointed me that Portugal, Brazil never had that ability. In this comment, we get to see some of the trendy new artwork we're going to be looking at. All of them look like very smug men, very arrogant smug men. Also, Pedro, his hat is so huge. It is gigantic. Very big hat. In this comment, there is a brief note to say that there have been map changes across the board, all across South America, for the main nations and some of the smaller ones too, making them into smaller states, which is important for stuff to talk about. And the final thing to mention is, have there been any changes to old Senor Hilter? Apparently he's quite the elusive fella, so you'll have to wait and see, which is effectively saying, yes, there have been changes to him. And it's on that I wanted to talk about as we move to the final screen. I'm kind of disappointed there wasn't a significant amount of content covering the representation, I guess, of Operation Bolivar, but also just the Axis powers in general's interest in Argentina in this dev diary, because I think it's something that, you know, while maybe people don't know a lot about Argentina's position in World War II generally, I think a lot of people are understanding that the Axis were interested in Argentina also as like an escape route. So the Easter egg is probably going to involve something like, if Germany loses the civil war against the Kaiser, they evacuate. In my dream world though, if I was to like sort of take control of this focus tree, something I really would have liked to have seen is the ability for you to work against the German Reich, but as a fasc. So the idea being that as Germany loses, you can capitalize on their losses by kind of importing their expertise, their manpower, their ideology, and effectively operate as the Fourth Reich in waiting. This, of course, ends with Mr. Hilter arriving into your country, and then it's game on. You start again, the fourth attempt. Surely, you know, fourth time's the charm, right? As it stands right now, though, I see no mechanics indicating that as Germany begins to lose the war, maybe as capitulation rate goes up, or as the war lingers on and on and on, you don't really have the ability to interact with them, like importing them in, so there's nothing to do with it. So yeah, a shame, I suppose. If you wanted to go really odd with it, and I mean really odd, something you could do is make it so that if Argentina has been split into even smaller states, as mentioned previously, you could give them a section of Patagonia, like maybe this section here if it becomes landlocked or something, and then the German player, once they capitulate, literally becomes like an OPM living in the mountains of Patagonia. And it really funny, if you really wanted to make it funny, they could get like a capitulation tree where they're like living in Patagonia as your puppet or something, and they eventually build themselves up again with the imported talent. And that could just kind of be like a fun final thing, so that people who are playing as Germany, once they lose, there's like a post-game loser content where they can either keep playing as West or East Germany, or the semi-meme path, if they've organized it with the Argentina going fasc, to go live in Patagonia. I know, it's all Easter eggs, it's all memes, but it would be kind of entertaining. Alright, I've talked your ear off. Who knows what we'll see? Argentina. Could be exciting. Really hard to say when you don't have full access to see what the focuses are about, but time will tell, I'm sure. With that, I'll say thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next week for Chile. If you liked, feel free to like, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Adios, amigos.